Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy. And in today's episode, we're going to go through the official figures that have been released by the Ministry of Finance in Russia for April. And whenever I post these videos, I do it once a month, there's always a lot of excitement in the comments. Some people saying you're making all of this up. These aren't Russia's official figures. Well, they are. You can find them yourself. If you go to minfin.ru/EN, if you want to read it in English, /document, then you'll be able to find all of these figures yourself. And also, I get a lot of comments from people saying, why are you bothering looking at official figures from Russia? They're all fabricated, they're all made up. Well, I have to do something in terms of using data. And if Russia is publishing data, I think it's worth looking at, going through and analysing and seeing exactly what Russia wants the world to be seeing in terms of its economy. And what we're going to see in today's video is a continuation of the trend that we've been seeing for the last 6 months or so, whereby the figures for 2024 are actually better than they were in 2023. The Russian economy seems to have turned a corner. However, that is all down to the war economy that President Putin is focusing in on. So we'll talk about that at the end of today's video and what the implications of that are for the Russian economy in the long term, because they're highly negative. And we'll also see that the figures for 2024 represent a significant downshift against the figures for 2021, which was the last full financial year before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So that was the last year that didn't have any impact of the current round of sanctions that have been applied against Russia. So in today's video, I'll have a look at what's going on with oil and gas revenues, because historically they were the most important source of revenue for Russia. However, over the last year or so, that situation has shifted, and that is quite bizarre for a country that has some of the largest oil and gas reserves in the world. We'll then talk about what's going on with non-oil and gas revenue, and this really relates to the war economy that Russia has shifted towards, and there's been a huge increase in non-oil and gas revenue. We'll talk about what the total revenue situation is, how it compares with this time last year and 2021. We'll also talk about expenditure, because that's one of the critical issues for Russia right now. It's investing a huge amount of money into the war in Ukraine, and obviously that investment isn't yielding anything. There are no returns from that investment. And then finally today, we'll talk about what's going on with regards to either the net loss or the net profit that Russia has posted. And I'll give you a heads up, spoiler alert, Russia is still making losses. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary. So what I think these figures tell us about what's happening in Russia right now, and what the long-term implications of what's happening now are for the Russian economy. But before we get into all of that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. I really, really mean this. If you've sent me a YouTube super thanks or bought me a coffee recently, thank you for the time and effort you've taken to do that. Really, really appreciate that support. And if you're a long-term supporter, either through Patreon, where you can get early access to my videos and watch them advert-free, or through Buy Me a Coffee membership or YouTube membership, where you'll also get early access to my videos, thank you for that long-term support. Really helps to keep me motivated. It tells me I'm doing something right and keeps me posting as many videos as I can. So thank you so much for that support. This chart shows the total amount of revenue that Russia has earned from oil and gas sales in the period between 2021 and the first 4 months of 2024. The 2021 figures are shown by the grey line, which is at the top of this chart. The 2022 figures are shown by the red line, the 2023 figures by the blue line, and the 2024 figures by the orange line. And the scale on the left-hand side of this chart is shown in billions of Russian rubles. And the first thing to notice about this chart, before we talk about the figures for 2024, is that Russia's best year in terms of oil and gas revenue was 2021, the grey line. The second best year that Russia has had over the last 4 years is 2022. And the worst year that Russia has had is 2023. Now, if we have a look at the figures for the first 4 months of 2024, the line is actually quite difficult to see because the orange line and the red line are almost moving in exactly the same pattern. But if you look closely, you can see that there has been a divergence in April. Total oil and gas revenue for the first 4 months of 2024 was 4.1 trillion Russian rubles, which equates to around $46 billion. And that figure represents an 82% increase against the 2.2 trillion rubles earned in the first 4 months of 2023. You can see the gap between the orange line and the blue line. And the reason why Russia's oil and gas income is significantly higher than it was in 2023 is that Russia is now achieving a higher price per barrel, partly as a result of the fact that oil prices have risen generally compared with this time last year, and also due to the fact that it's still selling oil above the $60 price cap to countries that are prepared to pay it. However, despite the improvement against this time last year, the figures for the first 4 months of 2024 represent a 13% fall against the same period for 2022. And obviously, part of that period was impacted by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which commenced on the 24th of February 2022, and a fall of 45% against the same 4 months of 2021. And as I mentioned at the start of today's video, 2021 was the last full financial year that was entirely unaffected by the war in Ukraine. So what this shows us is that compared with the situation before Russia invaded Ukraine, oil and gas revenues are down by 45%. And for a country that's entirely dependent on oil and gas historically, that's obviously an absolute disaster. If you were in charge of a major corporate and your sales were down 45% against the previous sales delivered by the previous chief executive, your job would be in the firing line. You potentially wouldn't survive that because a 45% fall is disastrous in any business whatsoever. But it's particularly a nightmare if your economy is entirely dependent upon it. However, as we'll see from the next section, Russia has done something about this. This chart shows the revenue earned by Russia from non-oil and gas sources. And what we've got here is a complete reversal of the trend that we just looked at for oil and gas revenues. The figures for 2021 are down at the bottom, so that was the worst year that Russia encountered in terms of non-oil and gas revenue. The second worst year was 2022. The second best year was 2023, and Russia's best ever year in its history for earning non-oil and gas revenue is the first 4 months of 2024. You can see that the orange line here is clearly at the top of this chart. In the 4 months to the end of April 2024, Russia earned 7.5 trillion rubles, which equates to around $84 billion from non-oil and gas revenues. And this is significant because non-oil and gas revenues are now almost double oil and gas revenues. So that means that Russia is no longer classified as an oil and gas economy. It's a non-oil and gas economy. And if we compare the figures for 2024 against the previous years, they represent an increase of 37% against the figures for 2023, 43% against 2022, and 200% against 2021. In the first 4 months of 2021, Russia only earned 2.5 trillion rubles from non-oil and gas sources. So what this tells us is that the Russian economy is changing. It's moving away from its dependence on oil and gas towards non-oil and gas revenue. And you might be sitting there thinking, well, what is non-oil and gas revenue? What is this major source of income that Russia has managed to find to be able to offset all of the income that it's lost from oil and gas? And the answer to that is it's because it's moved to being a war economy. And I've talked about this in many other videos. Basically, we've got a lot of industry in Russia that has now been commandeered to help with the war effort. So these are companies that previously were producing things that they were selling both in Russia and overseas. So it might be companies manufacturing products or goods or all sorts of different things. And Russia has decided that what they make could be used in Ukraine. So these companies have now been told to stop what they were doing historically and start making things either military equipment or clothing or ammunition or other things that can assist with the war effort. And the benefit for all of these companies is that they now have guaranteed orders. They are being given huge orders by the Kremlin, and those orders are being paid for by the Russian state. So they don't have any risk in terms of non-payment. They don't have to worry about shipping costs and marketing and competition and all of the things that a company would normally have to deal with in its ordinary course of business. These companies are now happily churning out millions of different items to be used in Ukraine. And this is providing a real boost to the Russian economy. And as we can see, 2024 represents a record year. The total non-oil and gas revenue of 7.5 trillion compares to 2.5 trillion before the war started. So this development is obviously good news from an accounting point of view. We're now looking at the figures and we can see that this non-oil and gas revenue is offsetting the huge fall in oil and gas revenue. However, there are major problems in terms of the long-term implications here because these companies are now becoming dependent on the state. They rely upon the state for those orders and those payments, and they're moving away from their traditional business. So they're no longer producing all of the things that they were historically, that they were selling all around the world. And the problem with that is obviously that if the war stops tomorrow, then those orders will dry up and these companies will be left high and dry. They will be in a situation where the Kremlin is no longer paying them and they'll then have to go back to fending for themselves, producing things, trying to win back their customers that they've lost during this period. And that's going to be very difficult. So the longer that the war in Ukraine goes on, the less competitive these companies will be because they're no longer active in the markets that they once were. And that's a major problem. And whilst these figures do look good on paper, these graphs look nice, we've got 2024 being a record year. The reality is all of this is being paid for by the state. The state is having to find money to be able to give to these companies. That's draining Russia's reserves, and at some point those reserves will run out because, as we saw from the oil and gas revenues, it's no longer earning the same sort of level of income that it was before the war started. This chart shows Russia's total revenue over the last 4 years. So what we've got here is a combination of the non-oil and gas and oil and gas revenues that we've just looked at. And what we can see here is a really interesting trend. Prior to 2024, Russia's best year in terms of total revenue was 2021, the grey line across the top. Its worst year in terms of the first 9 months of the year was 2023, so last year. However, you can see that after September, the blue line actually crosses over the red line. And that's because Russia was moving to being a war economy. It had started investing into all of its own companies, giving them guaranteed revenue in exchange for goods that were needed for Ukraine. So you can actually see the change in the Russian economy on this chart. And in the last 3 months of the calendar year, 2022 actually became Russia's worst year in terms of total revenue. And if you look at the orange line, which shows the figures for 2024, you can see that it's a record-breaking year for total revenue. But as we just discussed, that's mainly being driven by non-oil and gas revenue, so this war economy. Total revenue in the first 4 months of 2024 was 11.7 trillion rubles, which equates to around 130 billion US dollars. And that figure represents a 50% increase against total revenue for 2023, a 16% increase against 2022, and a 17% increase against 2021. So at face value, 2024 looks like a fantastic year for Russia. This is the highest amount of total revenue that Russia has earned at any time in the last 4 years. However, the critical issue here is that the driver of this increase in total revenue is the huge increase in non-oil and gas revenue, which is being sponsored by the Kremlin, and the actual business that Russia is doing with other countries, its oil and gas revenue, is down by 45%. So we've got a situation where the books look good, these figures present well. However, when you dig down into the detail, when you do the analysis, there are long-term fundamental problems that Russia is creating for itself, and the longer that the war in Ukraine goes on, the bigger those problems will be. This chart plots Russia's total expenditure over the last 4 years, and what we can see here is a very clear trend. 2021 was the year when Russia spent the least, 2022 was the second least, 2023 was when Russia spent the second most, and 2024 is a record-breaking year in terms of Russian expenditure. It's now spending more than it has done at any time in the last 4 years. And obviously the reason for that, the main driver for this huge increase in expenditure, is the war in Ukraine. It is costing billions of dollars every single week to keep the war effort going. In the first 4 months of 2024, Russia's total expenditure was 13.2 trillion rubles, which equates to around $146 billion. And to put that into perspective, the total oil and gas revenue in the first 4 months of 2024 was $46 billion. So a difference of $100 billion in the first 4 months between what Russia earned from oil and gas sales and what it spent in terms of total expenditure. And this is one of the fundamental problems for Russia right now. It might be earning a lot of money from oil and gas revenue, but if it's spending 3 times that amount on the war in Ukraine, at some point the cash is going to run out. And this lack of control on expenditure is getting significantly worse. The figure of 13.2 trillion for the first 4 months of 2024 represents an increase of 22% against the figure for 2023, an increase of 49% against the figure for 2022, and a whopping increase of 84% against the figures for 2021. And what we're seeing here is that Russia is spending an enormous amount of money every single month to keep the war going. And this is now putting a huge amount of pressure on the Russian economy. This would put pressure onto any economy. It doesn't matter how much you're earning. If you're spending 2 or 3 times the amount that you're earning, then you're going to have to finance the difference between your expenditure and your income by dipping into your reserves. And at some point, those reserves will run out. So the war in Ukraine cannot continue forever. This chart shows the net position for the Russian economy, so basically the difference between how much Russia is earning and how much Russia is spending, whether or not it's posting a net profit or a net loss. And what we can see here is that 2021 was Russia's best year by far in the last 4. It posted a profit in every single one of the 12 months, albeit there was a large amount of expenditure that was passed through in December. You can see that there's a downward movement in the graph in the very last month of the year. And that seems to be a common feature in Russian accounting. They pass through a lot of expenditure at the end of the calendar year. But you can see that there was a consistent amount of profit posted every single month. That was a very good year from Russia's point of view. However, in 2022, it decided to invade Ukraine, and you can see the impact of that on the Russian net profit. In 2022, Russia posted a net profit in the first 11 months. However, because of the large amount of expenditure that was passed through in December, the net figure for the end of 2022 was a loss of 3.3 trillion rubles, which is roughly around $37 billion. Now, the situation in 2023 was significantly worse, and in fact, Russia posted a net loss in every single month. And the total net loss for 2023, interestingly, was actually similar to the total net loss for 2022. It came in at 3.2 trillion rubles, and the reason for that is what we just discussed. In the latter part of 2023, Russia converted itself into being a war economy. The Kremlin started to sponsor a lot of businesses to pass a lot of non-oil and gas revenue through the accounts, and therefore that improved the situation towards the end of the year. But it still posted a net loss. If we now look at the situation for 2024, you can see that those losses have continued to be made, and Russia has posted a net loss in every single one of the first 4 months. And the reason for this is the huge amount of expenditure. We've just been through all of the detail. Russia is actually making oil and gas revenue and non-oil and gas revenue, and its total revenue is actually at record levels. But unfortunately, its expenditure is also at record levels, and that means that it's losing money. It's not actually making a profit, and that means that it's having to dig into its reserves to fund all of the war in Ukraine. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think it's important to have a look at the official figures that the Ministry of Finance in Russia are publishing. Whether or not you agree with them is a completely different story, but we have to take them at face value and provide some analysis. And what we've seen in today's figures is a continuation of the trend that we've been seeing for the last 8 or 9 months. The Russian economy is changing. Historically, it was entirely dependent on oil and gas. It has huge reserves of both of those products, and it was selling them all around the world. Now, obviously, over the last 2 years, things have shifted around a lot. The people who were previously buying Russian oil and gas have said that they no longer want it, and countries such as India and China have stepped in and increased their purchases. So Russia is still selling oil and gas. It's still making it. It's still pulling it out of the ground. It's producing it. It's refining it. It's exporting it. But the figures, as we've seen in today's video, are significantly down against where Russia was before it decided to invade Ukraine. Total oil and gas revenue is down by 45% compared with where Russia was in 2021. And when you take into account that oil prices have actually gone up over that period, Russia should actually be making more than it was in 2021. This should be a boom time for Russia. However, because of the sanctions and the problems that Russia is having and the discounts that it's having to offer, it's lost almost half of its revenue. And that's an absolute disaster for any country that's built up a huge oil and gas industry such as Russia. However, as we've also seen from the figures, Russia has quite cleverly managed to offset that fall. In fact, more than offset that fall with an enormous increase in non-oil and gas revenue. So this looks like really clever accounting. When you look at the figures, it looks like Russia is having its record year ever. But when you dig down into the detail and have a think about what the implications of this are, they really aren't good for the Russian economy, because what Russia is doing right now is converting itself into a war economy. The state is sponsoring lots of different businesses. It's keeping them afloat. It's giving them guaranteed business, guaranteed orders. And all of that looks great from the Kremlin's point of view. And the figures do look really impressive. But the long-term implication is going to be negative for the majority of those companies, because they've turned their back on their customers. They're becoming something different. They're now basically being owned and operated by the state. They're entirely dependent on those orders and that income. And if the war in Ukraine does stop at some point, then all of those orders are going to dry up, and these companies are going to have to fend for themselves. They're going to have to go back to doing what they were doing historically, and that means that they could be in a world of pain, because their customers are not going to hang around waiting for them to come back. They've already started buying from other companies in other countries. So what we're seeing here is that Russia is producing an impressive set of figures, but it's actually undermining the long-term viability of a lot of its companies. And the longer the war in Ukraine goes on, the higher is the risk that Russia will collapse into a recession, possibly even a depression, because all of these companies will be scrambling around trying to find some revenue. And if the oil and gas industry continues to operate at around 50% of what it was doing before the invasion of Ukraine, then that's going to have a huge detrimental impact as well. And as we've also seen from today's data, the expenditure that Russia is financing right now is off the scale. And the reason for this is obviously that Russia is funding the war in Ukraine. It's throwing billions of dollars every single week at the war, and it's not actually making enough money to be able to fund that. As we've seen, the net losses that Russia have been posting in 2023 and 2024 tell us that it's having to finance this from alternative sources. So Russia is currently drawing down on its reserves to keep the war going. And that is simply not a sustainable model. You can't just keep drawing down on your reserves, because at some point those reserves will run out. And as you'll know if you follow the channel, Russia had around $300 billion worth of overseas assets at the start of the war that have been seized by the West, and they're now considering what they're going to do with that, whether or not they can legitimately let Ukraine have some of that cash. They're currently talking about just giving them the interest, but there are lots of different clever ideas being put together in terms of reparation bonds and various other things. If you're interested in finding out more detail, please check out the video that I posted recently. But the overall summary of today's video is that the figures that Russia have posted for April 2024 show that oil and gas revenue is down by 45% against what Russia was doing in 2021 before it invaded Ukraine. However, Russia has managed to more than offset that with a huge increase in non-oil and gas revenue, which is basically state-sponsored business that the Kremlin is offering to all of these companies. That isn't really sustainable for the long term. But the most concerning factor from Russia's point of view is that it's continuing to spend a huge amount of money on the war in Ukraine. In fact, so much that it's posting a net loss every single month. That loss is being funded by Russia's reserves, and Russia will run out of reserves at some point if this situation doesn't change. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.